If you look at who gets rewarded in a typical meeting, society has a clear default. We consistently assume that the person who speaks first and loudest is the most capable individual in the room. But by measuring capabilities strictly through speed and volume, we miss a different, highly precise form of intellect. Psychologists call this silent intelligence. This trait exists independently of social anxiety, shyness, or a fear of public speaking. Because we expect intelligence to be loud, we routinely misdiagnose deliberate silence as incompetence or a slow processing speed. We assume the person who isn't talking simply has nothing to say, though they are running an active cognitive strategy. By dismissing the quietest person in the room, we filter out the exact analytical tools required to solve complex problems, especially when those rapid, knee-jerk reactions fail. Picture a standard networking event or office brainstorm. The person hanging back at the edge of the circle, letting others fill the silence, is usually written off as disengaged. What looks like disengagement is actually driven by a mechanism called input-output asymmetry. Input-output asymmetry is a cognitive processing style where a person deliberately takes in massively more information than they vocalize. This diagram illustrates the difference. On the left, we see the average listening habit. People listen only to formulate their next reply, bouncing information back and forth. On the right, we see the silent intellect's approach, gathering diverse inputs to decode the underlying meaning of the conversation. While others are planning their next sentence, the silent thinker is actively collecting data. They are logging micro-expressions, shifts in vocal tone, and paying close attention to what is deliberately left out of the discussion. This is why they avoid small talk. Discussing the weather or office gossip provides zero useful data. They discard the surface-level chatter to map out the mechanical, structural truths driving the interaction. To the outside observer, this intense internal focus is easy to misread. People assume the quiet individual is bored, aloof, or simply struggling to keep up. Delayed response times reflect the friction of assembling a complete, multi-layered understanding of the room before taking action. Now, imagine a high-stress crisis at work. A deadline is missed, budgets are cut, and panic sets in. It becomes the default reaction for almost everyone involved. This diagram shows what happens next in the mind of a quiet problem solver. When a rapidly approaching threat hits, they utilize an emotional pause. They deliberately expand the buffer zone between the external stimulus and their internal reaction. This buffer is managed by the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain responsible for complex planning, decision-making, and moderating social behavior. It neutralizes impulsive, survival-based reactions like anger or panic, breaking the threat down into structured, manageable data. When coworkers call this behavior cold or unfeeling, they misinterpret the mechanism. This calmness signals a brain that maps out emotional data points and processes them systematically before they can trigger an outburst. This emotional regulation directly impacts how they view their own abilities, leading to what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger reverse. The Dunning-Kruger effect usually describes people with low ability overestimating themselves, but the reverse means highly competent individuals naturally underestimate their own intelligence because they are acutely aware of how much they still do not know. Because their primary goal is objective truth rather than ego validation, they have no problem saying, "I don't know," or "I was wrong." This intellectual humility allows them to adapt their thinking the moment new facts emerge. Running this heavy, continuous cognitive load burns a massive amount of mental energy. Their need for solitude is a biological requirement to process data and recharge. Appearing emotionally detached or hesitant often signals a brain prioritizing an accurate view of reality over performative confidence. Silence functions as a high-bandwidth cognitive strategy. This requires us to change how we manage crises. When chaos hits, we need to stop looking to the first person who shouts out an immediate answer. Instead, we can seek out the individual who has the capacity to admit ignorance up front and the patience to wait for the actual patterns to emerge. Loud guesswork might feel reassuring in the first few seconds of a disaster, but it consistently falls apart upon execution. Silent, calculated problem-solving actually resolves the issue. When the performative intellect runs out of answers, the silent gathering of patterns remains to uncover the truth.